Hey everybody, welcome back. In this video today, I'm working with sandracereals.com and we are talking about pancake dies in the hydraulic press. And not only just pancake dies, but layered pancake dies. That opens up a whole new world and makes your designing even easier. Let's take a look now. Now you all know that I love to make layered pieces. It's something that I've done for a long time, and it hasn't always been as easy as it is right now. So as you can see, I've got two different pieces and I'm going to show you how to make both of these pieces today. But notice that each of them have multiple layers. So I have one that has 3 different layers and then another that has 4 different layers. Very different looks. Some of them I have formed and others I have just left flat, but I've textured a little bit for some interest. When we are looking at a pancake die, it's called a pancake die because they're flat. And basically they're just cookie cutters that cut out a flat piece of metal. So in this case, we've cut out a flower. Now, the thing I really like about these pancake dies is that they are nice and crisp, and also they're open and ready to go. Now, people have asked, like, what gauge or what thickness are these pancake dies? Each die is 11 gauge, which is approximately 2.3 millimeters thick. Now, one of the things that I really like about the sandracereals.com website is that it actually gives you some layers to choose from. And she's already put these together as sets, but you get to pick and choose which one you purchase. So for this set, this is the LAY 701, and there are 3 different layers that go together. The second set that I chose for this video is the LAY 705, and it is going to feature 4 different layers, all different sizes and shapes. And when you choose to purchase an entire set, there is a 5% discount that is applied. Now, when it comes to using a pancake die, you are going to want to use a little thicker metal. And so I would highly suggest that you stick with something about 20 gauge. Okay, 20 gauge is about 0.8 millimeters, and that's going to give you a nice thick piece. If you choose to use anything thinner than that, let's say 22 gauge, you are going to be left with a burr that's going to need to be cleaned up. So what I would do on this is when we put our piece in here, we want to make certain that we clear it so that we cut all of the important points of our piece. Now, I could bring this down to right about here, where I then cut like almost at those points of the star that I'm working with here. But you don't want to go below these 2 circle points. Anything below that, it's not going to cut. And you can see already, like, there's a thicker curve here, and that's definitely not going to cut for you. You want to have a nice tight tolerance on these pancake dies when you cut. When you apply pressure to this, and this is going to be in the hydraulic press, you only need to go through enough to cut this through. Don't give it a ton of pressure beyond that cutting action. A lot of times, especially if you've got a larger die, you're going to hear a very loud pop. People often ask what materials you can use in this. More often than not, I'm using copper and silver, but you can also use gold and brass as well. I just don't have a lot of those materials that I use in my work. First, I use some of the cut lube that comes with my Sandracereals hydraulic press. I don't want to put this onto my pancake dies, but rather onto my metal. This will help the dies cut through the metal and helps protect the cutting edge. I want to place the cutting portion into the middle of the press and raise the platen until I feel and hear the metal cut through. Sometimes this is a very loud bang. There will always be a tab left, and if you are using a symmetrical die, you can simply rotate your piece and cut the tab portion by placing it back into the press. To remove the cutout, I like to hold the die in my hands and will tap the top edge of the die on my table or onto a bench block. This typically works well with larger or less detailed pieces, but sometimes you will still need to use a pair of pliers to help dislodge a piece. Sometimes when I remove the tab, the metal will simply bend over and not cut entirely through. At this point, I can use some hand shears to remove those pieces. I'm going to repeat this process for each layer of the piece that I am making. For this piece, I am using a 3-piece die set, the LAY 701. Part of the fun is trying to decide how to layer your pieces.
When using laser cut pancake dies, they often leave a small burr on the back side of the piece. If I'm working on a lot of pieces, I like to use my belt sander to remove those burrs. You want to be very careful as those pieces will also become hot. Once the burr is removed, I smooth out the surface with an abrasive wheel on my polishing arbor. For the top piece, I've decided to use 5 tube settings, 1 in 6mm and 4 in the corners that are 2mm each. I use a paste flux for everything. To help distribute the heat a little bit, I also like to suspend my piece on top of some pieces of a solder board. I also use the flame to dry the flux a little bit. This will help keep the solder from bubbling out. I want to be very careful to not apply too much heat to the settings as they are more likely to melt, so I want to heat the piece from below. Once the solder has flowed, I quench and place it into an acid bath to remove the oxides. Meanwhile, I solder the next 2 layers together. Once again, I place the flux and solder onto the bottom piece. Then I will take the top piece and layer it onto the bottom, sandwiching the solder, and once again, using the boards to hold my piece up a little bit to allow for that heat to come in from all directions. You can tell that the solder has flowed when the top piece collapses onto the bottom. Once again, quench and pickle. Now that everything is clean, I'm going to solder the top layer onto the bottom too. I follow the same steps as before. Again, I want to bring that heat in from the lower layers. This time, I'm simply going to lift the piece with my solder pick to heat from behind. It is time to set our stones. I like to place the stone upside down and then place the setting onto the piece in this way. I use a bezel setting punch to secure the stone and burnish the setting. Repeat for the 4 smaller stones as well. Sometimes I will also use a sticky pick or beeswax to place the stone. As a final finishing step, I wanted to have a satin finish that would bounce the light slightly. So in this case, I am using a radial disc to work around each of these settings, but you can use any number of finishes. I have also already darkened that textured layer with some liver of sulfur. Next, we will use the 4-layer set LAY 705. I will follow the same steps for cutting out the shapes. When we use an asymmetrical shape, we cannot use the die to remove that tab. So here I use a marker to identify where I will cut away the tab. This is simply done with a jeweler's saw. I can also use a file to remove the burrs, or I can head back over to the belt sander. Now that each of my pieces have been prepared, it is time to texture them. I use a sharp texturing hammer to give a little bit of interest. I don't want this piece to be flat, so I'm also going to use a riveting hammer to knock some grooves into the edge of a 2x4 cutoff. This gives me an area to hammer into for the petals. Using a riveting hammer, I can then hammer each of the petal ends into the grooves. Pay attention to how the metal is moving, and you can do all sorts of things. Before this step, I do find it helpful to anneal the metal. It will make it much easier to work with. I do not need to hammer the entire layer, as most of it will be covered with the layer above it. Notice on the second layer, I'm actually forming from behind so that I don't ruin the texture I have already placed onto the piece. I will use the flat face of the hammer to bring the center section down a little, as it currently sits quite proud. After forming each petal, I will place it onto the one before in the stack to make sure they fit together nicely. Hammering each of these layers will also give each one quite a bit of strength. Once Once all the petals are formed, I use a dapping punch to remove some of the empty space between each layer in the center. This will ensure that I can cut a proper length of tubing for the rivet that will hold the pieces together. I'm going to use this hand punch to place a 5/32 inch hole into the center of each layer. I like to place them all on the tubing that I will be using so I can get the layout just right. It also allows me to mark how long to cut that tubing. The tubing needs to be about 2 millimeters longer on each side of the stack. To set the tube rivet, I find a second pair of hands is very helpful. Place the rivet onto the ball of a dapping punch. Using the center punch, flare one side of your rivet. Then flip it over and repeat. I continue to flip and flare until the rivet can be finished off with a small hammer. Once completed, apply any desired finish or patina.